Mia, do you want to kick off the recording? Great. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so we have a few topics for discussion today. Starting with, let's start with our usual priorities that we do every morning, every meeting. So first thing, permissionless hubs. We actually managed to ship this last week, thanks to Aditya. So as of 2 days ago, you should be able to spin up a hub, just hit connect, point it at one of the existing hubs, and you'll just automatically join the network. There's no more approval process, anything like that. We have some heuristics in place to protect against malfunctioning hubs that spam the network. So there's some like basic rate limits and stuff. But overall, we expect this to work reasonably well. May have bugs if the network grows very, very quickly, which we'll react to as we go along. But this has been like a pretty important milestone for us, and we're very excited that we're here. And hopefully it means that a lot more people are spinning up hubs as the days go by. Second topic is permissionless signups. So we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the next section. We expect the ETA for this to be sometime in September or October, and we're actually tracking pretty well on schedule here. So we think this is going to land on time or maybe even a little bit early. And once this is done, anyone's going to be able to go to the contract, pay the storage fee, and sign up. We've added a third priority from the last meeting, which is Hub DevX. So you might have seen my thread on Warpcast or Farcaster a little while ago about wanting to collect feedback from people who've had difficulty setting up the hubs. And there's a bunch of improvements that we're going to be making, which we're prioritizing, again, to make it easier to set up and run hubs, ranging from debugging errors to reducing the requirements to run a hub, and all the way down to having better monitoring and dashboards. Last priority is features. We actually don't have much on this plate right now. Like the entire focus is just on getting to permissionless signups, but we might add some stuff over here as time goes on. Okay, so the big takeaway for folks on this call, particularly if you're building apps, is there are going to be breaking changes coming with the migration because the contracts are moving to a different change. In particular, I think there's two important changes. One is if you are using the signer APIs on Warpcast, i.e. you're requesting signers, we're changing the way signers work in the new contracts. And as a result, the APIs will also change. So you're going to need to be calling a different set of APIs to make all of this work. Hopefully it's a pretty seamless transition. It just involves changing APIs, adding a signature, and changing some parameters. And we'll go over that in a little more detail in the next section. But if you are generating signers, and I know a lot of you are today, this is going to be a change we have to make as we cut over from the old version to the new version. The second breaking change is anyone listening to contracts will obviously have to start listening to the new contracts. So, anything that was pointed at L1 Gurley network will now have to point to the Optimism mainnet and start reading those contracts. For the most part, if you're using hubs and you're getting all your data via hubs, they should transition pretty smoothly. We programmed in a lot of migration. They're connected to both networks and they'll cut over when the migration happens. But if you are for any reason reading directly from the contracts, you'll have to change this when the migration happens. And the last thing is there'll be some Warpcast downtime when the migration happens, just because we need to point the whole application at the new set of contracts and make sure that happens smoothly. Expect it to be a few hours at most, and we'll announce when that's coming once we have more clarity on the schedule. But that's basically it. So diving into the topics in a little more detail. So with the 1.4.6 release, hubs are now permissionless. We're about a week ahead of schedule, and there were 43 hubs last night. If you aren't running 1.4.6, it would be very helpful if you upgrade, because any hub running less than that is not going to appear with the new hubs, and the new hubs are going to be a little slower. So all of Warpcast's hubs are now running at 1.4.6, and we encourage everyone to upgrade when they get a chance. Okay, the main topic that I want to talk about is permissionless signups and getting into the sort of three big things that are going to be releasing over the next few weeks. The first one is flexible storage. There's a video overview here that I encourage everyone to watch if you haven't watched it already. But the sort of TLDR on this feature is we're now going to be charging for storage on the network. And that gives you a couple of nice properties, right? So today, everybody has to store everybody can only store 10,000 casts, and it starts expiring once you cross that limit. This change is going to let people who want to have greater amounts of storage pay for more data on the network. And we've set the initial fee to $5. So the idea is you pay $5, you get something on the order of 10,000 or 20,000 messages spread across all your different message sets. You can pay additional amounts to store larger and larger amounts and eventually store as much history as you would like. The price is something we're going to tweak over time. The main goal is to balance the difference between, or balance the extremes between making it easy for people to sign up, but also adding some friction so people aren't signing up and spamming a bunch of junk data on the network. And we don't know if the right point is going to be $1, $5, or $10, but it's likely somewhere within that range. And at first, we'll tweak it manually. And over time, you can imagine that we have a more automated contract that changes the price based on supply and demand. The spec here kind of covers everything, the mechanics of how everything works. This has been implemented and will automatically switch on when the migration happens. So about 1 day after we migrate to the new contracts, everyone's data will get pruned according to these limits. If you're a current Farcaster user, everyone's going to automatically get 2 storage units for free. And what that's going to mean is you have, this is what you get for 1 storage unit. So you get about 5,000 casts, 2,500 reactions, 2,500 links, 50 verifications, and 50 user data. So you'll get double of all these limits. So it's going to be slightly higher than the limits that you have today. So all current data will just be migrated. And then once we're on mainnet, you can go and purchase more storage if you'd like. Cool. Any questions on storage contract before I move on to the next piece? All right. The second big change is on-chain signers, and this FIP is finally in review today. So would encourage everyone who's interested in this topic to read through and leave comments. And thanks to the folks like Hirsch who've already done that. The quick version of on-chain signers is, well, today you have the notion of signers. An app can ask a user to authorize a key that they control, and then the app's now allowed to post on behalf of the user. So this is a nice and easy way to spin up a new client, spin up a new bot, or anything like that that can post on behalf of a user. The problem with the current system is that signers are done off-chain, and there's 2 usability problems that come out of this. The first one is we have to have a limit on how many signers a user can generate. Otherwise, you could generate 1 billion messages and upload it to the hubs and crash the hub. So there has to fundamentally be some numeric limit to the number of signers you can create. And the problem is because of the way CRDTs and hubs work, when that limit is exceeded, the only way you can sort of control the size of that set is to drop the earliest message and say, hey, we're just going to delete the oldest signer. And this is a problem because as a user keeps adding new apps and trying new things, it's very likely that they'll end up accidentally deleting their oldest or earliest app if they're not using a wallet that actually manages all of this and alerts them that this is going to happen. And this is super frustrating for people, right? It's like very easy to shoot yourselves in the foot. Few developers have run into this problem already when testing out their applications. It would be really ideal if you could have sort of last in, first out rules. So like when you try to add the 101st signer, the system actually tells you like, hey, you can't do this, but that's actually not possible to implement in sort of this distributed CRDT model that we have. So it leads to a pretty crappy user experience. The second problem, and this one's a little more annoying, is if you were to transfer your FID on chain, let's say for whatever reason you wanted to change wallets, the way the signer works is the address that held the FID approves the signer, which then approves the message. And so at the moment that this transfer happens, that chain is invalidated because the address that signed the FID, signed the signer, is no longer valid because it no longer holds the FID. And so we can sort of come up with like clever hacks, like saying, hey, if you detect a signer, if you detect a transfer, give the user 2 days to upload the new signed message and don't delete their old messages. But there's always this like area of friction where like if the user forgets to upload this new message or doesn't realize it because they're using like MetaMask or something to transfer this address, they just end up nuking all of their messages. And again, that's a really, really bad user experience. So proposal that we came up with was actually tracking signers on chain using a key registry contract. And you can kind of see the high level of how this works here. But basically, there's a separate key registry that allows a user to map these signers on chain by making a transaction. And this solves the 2 problems that we talked about in a couple of ways. One is because everything is a blockchain transaction, and it's happening on OP mainnet. There's sort of this organic fee mechanism that prevents spam and prevents you from creating like a billion messages and flooding the hub. So there's this natural limit on how easily you can create signers. So we don't have to have this artificial 100 signers limit anymore. The second nice property is in the key registry, we don't actually map the address to the signer. So it's not the custody address that it used to be, but we start mapping the FID to the signer. So when you make a call to the key registry from, let's say, address 123, the key registry checks, hey, do you have an FID? And let's say you own the FID2, it then maps a new signer to FID2. So even if FID2 jumps between a bunch of addresses, its relationship to the signer is always valid because it's actually mapped on chain. And this is something that we couldn't really do easily off chain because you need the signature from the address. But when it is on chain, you can actually take this dependency between contracts and get this nice property. Okay, that's the high level on how signers work. So the TLDR for anyone like, just interacting with this at a very high level is previously you generated a message. Now you have to generate an on-chain transaction. Workcast will have nice APIs that handle all of this stuff for you. And we're going to let users create a few signers for free. So this should be largely just changing APIs if you're calling Workcast APIs today, and we'll publish a doc that walks through the exact migration in more detail. There's a lot more nuance to the spec around how these signers are generated and exactly what properties you need to pass in, what types of keys are used, etc. I'm not going to go into all of that in great detail on this call today, but if you have any questions, you can always DM or follow up or use the dev chat and we can go back and forth on that. Or ideally, leave comments down here. There's actually an implementation of this already merged into the contracts registry. We have some sample code here that lets you see how all of this works if you're interested in digging into the details. Okay, let's pause for a minute here and see if folks have questions. I know this is a fairly complicated topic, so we'll see if people have questions before we move on to the next thing. All right, easy crowd today. The last topic that we're going to have is mainnet release. So we're going to be shipping both of these changes along with all the other new contract stuff to OP mainnet. We're aggressively targeting next week on Wednesday. That's our optimistic goal for moving to the mainnet, no pun intended. There's a chance that it slips. I think we have a lot of moving pieces coming together, and so we sort of have this window of 1 to 2 weeks where we think we'll do the migration. So the way to think about how the migration happens is there's two basic steps. The first step is move all the contracts over and copy all the state over. So we'll deploy the contracts, we'll copy over everyone's registrations, signers, all of this stuff, and seed it in these contracts. So when we cut over, this is going to be an exact copy. Once this is done, signups are still going to be gated. There's still going to be a single server that can actually register signups just like they are today. And we're going to make sure that all of these contracts work as expected for another 1 to 2 weeks. After 1 to 2 weeks, we're going to have one of two outcomes. Either everything's working great and we just switch on permissionless signups and we burn this notion of having a trusted caller to the contracts, or we find bugs and issues and we have to deploy a new version of the contracts and we kind of go through that same process again. So in the best case, we're looking at a few weeks, 3 to 4 weeks to getting to permissionless signups. In the worst case, maybe it's 1 to 2 months before we actually get there. That's the high level of how we're approaching this migration. We'll have a doc with more detailed write-up on the exact dates and how we're planning to go through all of these steps. But we just wanted to call out that there's some uncertainty around this and there's a lot of moving pieces. So would not be surprised if the dates slip at the last minute or get pulled back a little bit earlier. We're trying our best to be as stable and predictable as possible, but there's just some moving pieces that we can't control here. Okay, any questions on this before we move on to DevX and some of the other topics? Cool. So the two things that we're focusing on for Hubble developer experience, first one is dashboards for monitoring. One of the biggest pain points we heard from people was hey, I don't know if my hub is in sync. I don't know how long it's going to take for my hub to be in sync. I have no idea what the status of the network is. So we're going to ship hubs with a default Docker configuration that has the sort of standard open source monitoring stack, Prometheus and Grafana. This is actually out there already. If you run the latest version of Hubble, there's actually a dashboard that you can set up, and you can run this instance, and it will show you some basic metrics. We might refine that over time a little bit, but you now just get this out of the box monitoring experience that tells you, how many peers you're connected to, whether you're in sync with them, and all the basic stuff that you care about. The second thing that we noticed is a lot of folks run into issues when setting up their hubs, and this ranges from like my Docker doesn't have permissions to write to this file, or I don't have a girly alchemy or RPC URL configured correctly, and so on. And so we're going to have this sort of like more wizard-like CLI system that actually walks you through all of these steps and helps you set each one of those up correctly, which is going to be a lot nicer to use. Those are the first two improvements. We've got a bunch more planned that we're researching and thinking about, including things like how do we make updates more seamless so people don't have to SSH in and like manually restart things every time, but it will actually be more progressive. We expect some of these things to be shipping very soon, and we'll keep you all updated on further changes. There've been a couple questions on permissionless signup, so let me flip back to Bill's question on the Warpcast invite system. So the short answer is TBD. I think the most likely case will be Workcast might still have an invite system where you can do something like you can invite someone and pay for their registration. And so that gives you the ability to send your friend an invite and say like, hey, I've pre-funded this, so when you sign up, your sign up is free, or something along those lines. That actually works. But a Workcast invite is no longer the only way you can get on the network. You can go, there'll be a sign up page where you can just go and sign up yourself and get onto the network. And you can always interact with the contracts directly and get to the network. The second question on permissionless signups, the short answer is yes. You'll be able to onboard a fully new user who's never used Farcaster. Like you should just be able to write an app that talks to the contracts. You'll need to store the user's recovery phrase, and you'll be able to set them up as a Farcaster user. And yes to that as well, Bill. Anyone who's signed up on Farcaster Network will be able to use Warpcast. You could just have to bring your recovery phrase that's associated with wherever you signed it up, and you have to import it into Warpcast so that we have the ability to create signers and all of that stuff, and then you'll be able to use the app. All right, moving down to any updates on anti-spam measures? So, okay, a few more questions, but let me start with the anti-spam one, and Dan, feel free to jump in if you have thoughts on this. But at a high level, I think there's two ways that we're thinking about dealing with spam. The first one is adding a cost to joining the network is going to be a limiting factor. If you don't have any cost to join the network and anyone can sign up, it's very likely that you'll just be flooded with lots and lots of spammers and lots of messages that are junk. It's not going to be sufficient to stop spam. In fact, we expect a decent amount of spam to still get through, despite having a $5 sign up. If you just look at the number of people that register ENSs looking for airdrops and other things, there's a decent community of people that are willing to spend, $20 to $30 to get there. And so we expect a lot of people will get through. The way we think you have to deal with spam structurally is at the client level, primarily because spam is this thing that is subjective, right? Like different clients and different people might have different takes on what spam is. And the nature of what spam is changes from time to time. It might be people posting replies with a bunch of junk links. It might be people spamming a bunch of likes on your casts, and you're like, hey, who is this and why are people liking my things? So there's fundamentally a lot of different ways in which you can spam, and we expect those to change over time. And so Warpcast is just going to take a more measured approach to reacting to this stuff quickly. We just shipped very recently the ability to report like casts or accounts. So you can click on something and hit the report button, and that will flag it as potential spam. And then we'll do a lot of analytics and data processing and try to filter out notifications and messages from accounts that are particularly spammy. Dan, anything you want to add on there before I jump to the other questions that people have?
No, you didn't know. Yeah, I think, look, we're going to take this super seriously, and I don't think we can do it preemptively. Like, I think that there's a component of this where we have to be reactive. So we are going to put buffer in our team's resources for that kind of like post permissionless sign up week, and come up with things that are kind of iterative and pragmatic. Open to other people's ideas, especially people who are building clients and things like that. But I think for now, we're putting the infrastructure in place where people can report. I've actually started nerfing accounts. So we had nerfs since last December, and the first nerfs we've actually done are in the last month. And I've been somewhat liberal in terms of just accounts that are, there was an account today that was just airdrops and just kind of scammy stuff. I just hit nerf. That is not censored to the protocol, but Warpcast people don't necessarily need to see that. And I think getting to a place where we've iteratively figured some of this out beforehand, reacting to whatever happens post sign up, and then being really good about communicating out to the other devs, and then starting probably with a centralized Warpcast solution, and then figuring out long-term how to actually incentivize this and get this into the protocol. Because long-term goal is a developer shouldn't be spending 30, 40, 50% of their time building a new app dealing with spam, right? Now, one thing to point out is email. All spam is done at, for the most part, the client level. There is a consortium of people, and that's why it's so hard to spin up a new email server. I don't think we want to hit that because that creates oligopic power within the network. But I think to start, the whole network's now going to be decentralized, and I think spam is a kind of value add service, so we can start with that centralized and work on getting it decentralized over time.
Cool. And then David, your question is, will Warpcast publish their nerf spam list for smaller clients to use in the interim? Short answer is yes. I think we want to make this data available for other clients to use to bootstrap, and we have to figure out the exact format that will do it. It'll likely be in some way where each client can self-report all the decisions that they're making, and then other clients can use that as input and decide whether or not they want to take action. So it'll likely include something like, here's the FID, here's a standard set of reasons that we've all agreed to, and here's the decision we made and when we made that decision. And then each client is free to accept or not accept some of those suggestions. And this will purely be a client level coordination thing. If there is a way to turn this into something at the protocol level, that's something we'll consider. But right now, I think client level coordination is probably enough to get like a reasonable level of spam protection across all clients. Cool. Manan had a question. Post on-chain signers, is Warpcast planning to subsidize transaction gas fees for adding a signer for a certain amount of time, or will users be expected to fund their wallet inside Warpcast to approve new ones? So this is a good question. Let me talk about the ideal end state that we're going to get to, and then the sort of steps to getting there. So the ideal end state, which I think we'll get to by the end of the year, is users should just be able to, when they sign up, like Apple Pay or Google Pay, right from their phones and say, I would like to pay, X dollars to register or to add a signer. And behind the scenes, the application actually funds the wallet, makes the transaction, and does everything in a very seamless way. So you as a user never have to think about buying ETH, bridging it to L2, then making a transaction, because that process is just too complicated, right? We might even have something that's like a subscription where we say, hey, if you pay Warpcast, $5 a month, you automatically get like 30 to 40 signers that you can add every month or something like that. So it's either going to be a pay-as-you-go model or like a pay one time. But the idea is to make that payment as low friction as possible. So it's very, very easy to add signers. And we think the cost of these is roughly going to be in like 5 to 15 cents. That's kind of the range at which these transactions are going right now. And once 4844 comes out, it's likely that they're going to fall by another 10x. So we're talking about, 1 cent or potentially sub-cent costs for these transactions, which are pretty easy to subsidize from an application's perspective. The steps to getting there. So when we first launch on mainnet, Warpcast is not going to have all of the infrastructure to handle payments, convert ETH, and do all of that. So we're going to just allow everybody that's currently in the system to get some number of free transactions for signers. So we might give a limit of, say, like, hey, everybody gets to 10 to 50 signers that they can add and remove for free for the next 2 months while we're setting up all of this infrastructure. And Warpcast will basically pay for those transactions while we get all the payment stuff going. Cool. There's a question from Christopher on, are you already thinking about an appeals process? So I think to be clear, we're not going to make any protocol level judgments on what is and what isn't spam. What's probably going to happen is Warpcast will have a set of heuristics that it applies to its users and its clients and says like, hey, we're going to have this system that, determines who's being spammy, who's not. And we're going to do things like just reduce the number of notifications, reduce the number of messages, and so on. So if you're a spammy account, it's not like you're blocked from the network, you can never use Farcaster, but there'll be a range of things ranging from your notifications stop showing up in other people's notifications because you're generating thousands of them. Your replies may not show up if they have certain keywords, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole range of tools that we're going to apply to actually deal with the spam problem. And a lot of that is going to be automated and just evolves based on like your patterns as a user. So if you stop spamming users with a bunch of likes, and that actually continues for a while, your notifications may start showing up again to other users. So wherever possible, we're going to avoid trying to do this thing where it's like a decision that's made and you're stuck in this for life. And it's more going to be a heuristic that's applied. And if you fall into the bucket of abusing some heuristic, then you get some penalty. And if you stop doing that, then you move out of the penalty zone. And again, this is a purely Warpcast thing. Each client is free to use whatever it wants for its own heuristics and its own spam filtering, and Warpcast will try to make its decisions as transparent as possible on why certain decisions were made. Cool. If I run a hub and it has a limit on messages being stored, should I be prepared post permissionless that most non-spam casts would get flushed out pretty quickly by the influx of spam? So no, it's per user or per FID is how the limits are established. So the filtering happens based on each user's messages. So if someone's spamming, they're going to truncate their own message history. Last question, will the frictionless payments feature be open source, made available for other apps building on Farcaster to use? So, I mean, most of it is just integrations with like backend services and payment processors. There's not a lot to really open source. It's called the Apple API and move some funds over and purchase Ethereum on chain. So it's for better or for worse, each application is going to have to set up that infrastructure themselves. There's a bunch of tooling already out there, like Dan linked to OpenZeppelin Defender and a few other things that you could use to automatically bridge all of this stuff. So there's a bunch of great tools that you can plug into your apps that basically does all of this for you today and Dan. Cool. All right, we'll do a last call for questions and give people a minute to chime in if they have anything else that they want more clarity on.
Just one thing, we want feedback on potential solutions here from people's point of view. I think we're really focused on getting to permissionless, credible neutrality for the network, and then there's going to be a whole set of new problems to solve for, right? Like we've spent a lot of time over the last 2 years getting hubs in place, like moving towards this mainnet migration, and then turning on permissionless signups. There's going to be some turbulence with that, like there's no way to avoid that. But I do think that the more people are kind of sharing their point of view, asking tough questions, particularly doing that on the dev channel on Farcaster, maybe a little less on Telegram, because I actually think it surfaces other people who might not even be developers, but might be good at thinking adversarially and other things like that. And so what I would encourage are people to just have those conversations. It doesn't mean that we're like going to respond and be like, yes, you are right. It's actually more like we should be airing out kind of thinking through this stuff collectively. And hopefully we can get to a pretty pragmatic set of solutions pretty quickly after we're permissionless.
Cool. That brings us to the end of the call. Shout out to Hirsch for helping us upgrade libp2p last week, and a few other folks for making other contributions to the repos. We will chat again 2 weeks from now, and hopefully we'll be already on mainnet by then. And I'll be posting a lot of stuff on Farcaster with updates on the mainnet release, the on-chain signers, and a guide on what you need to do to transition from the old signer API to the new signer API. So cool. Thanks everyone for joining today. We'll see you all soon.